Hi, it's me, the back alley whore of classical music. I really like musicals. I think musical theater is the best art medium out there. And because I really like musicals, and I've played for a lot of musicals, I know about a lot of musicals. And I think there are a lot of them that are underrated. They're either underrated because they're obscure, or they're underrated because I think they don't get the appreciation that they deserve. Enough chit chat. If you read the title and have basic reading comprehension training, you know what this video is talking about. Number 1 is The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. This musical is obscure in the sense that its soundtrack isn't on Spotify, and a lot of people, even if they're theater goers, don't know this musical. Chances are, if you went to a performing arts school growing up, you've at least heard of this musical. Obviously, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer was a novel by Mark Twain, and the music and lyrics to the show were done by Don Schlitz. Now, Don Schlitz is a fun, funky name that you've probably never heard of. His last name sounds like a slur, but even though you've probably never heard of him, you've definitely heard his songs before. He's one of those people who the name doesn't ring any bells, but then you listen to his music and you know who he is. For example, he wrote The Gambler, that was most famously recorded by Kenny Rogers. And because this was written by a country artist, the music is kind of country-esque. This would normally be a turn-off for me, but it's less honky-tonk country and more like bluegrass. And I actually really like bluegrass. I play the banjo. A lot of the songs have stuff like "Hey, Tom Sawyer." Those are called rolls. Banjo rolls are basically arpeggios. If you play any other instrument that's not banjo, it's just when you have a chord and you do some kind of pattern to like... It's an arpeggio. As a side note, you'd be surprised how many musicals use banjo, and not just like the old hokey ones, but like modern musicals. Hamilton has a banjo in it. The Addams Family has a banjo in it. There's a lot of banjo in musical theater. Anyways, to fit the bluegrass vibe, the instrumentation is bluegrass instruments. You have, snare drum with brushes, mandolin, fiddle, banjo, and acoustic guitar. And I don't know, I find bluegrass music to be oddly endearing. I think it's because I was raised with all that, barnyard children's movie shit, the one with like the puppets of like the pigs who go like crawling in the mud. I think bluegrass music reminds me of a simpler time. Anyways, the story to this musical is nothing that's particularly exciting or well executed, which I think is the reason why this musical didn't end up doing super well and isn't performed very often these days. The story centers around Tom Sawyer, obviously, who's this 13-year-old kid living, I think, in Missouri? No, Mississippi. Hang on, let me look it up. He is in Missouri, on the banks of the Mississippi River. Okay. And Tom Sawyer is a real wily character. He's kind of like a little Odysseus. He's pretty good at outsmarting people, and he can manipulate them into getting what he wants.
1 minute. Spell every state in the Union. Go!
Everystate.
And he wants to have an adventure because he's sick of going to school or whatever. And then there's a subplot with his best friend Huckleberry Finn, who's this like poor kid whose dad is an alcoholic and beats him or something. And he gets taken in by a widow and taught to read and write. And that's actually a really fun subplot.
I can read and I can write, they were wrong. I can tell you what these words are all day long.
Anyways, the main antagonist is Injun Joe. Injun Joe is an outlaw who's looking for Merle's gold, which is some fucking like secret El Dorado gold deposit or something. And along the way, because he's a bad guy, Injun Joe fucking murders someone. And Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn witness it. They take a vow not to tell anyone about it because they don't want Injun Joe to come after them next. But someone else gets framed for the murder, so Tom Sawyer speaks up and confesses that he witnessed Injun Joe kill them. And that's Act 1. Then Tom Sawyer falls in love with a girl named Becky, who, by the way, in the original production of this was played by none other than Kristen Bell. If you for some reason don't know who Kristen Bell is, she was a voice actor for Anna in Frozen, and she's done a lot of other things too. Fun fact, my mom fought Kristen Bell. My mom and Kristen Bell got into some political argument on social media, and Kristen straight up took it to the DMs. That's how heated it got. I think they ended it fairly amicably, but how fucking stuck up do you have to be as successful as Kristen Bell and still feel the need to take social media arguments to the DMs with random strangers? My mom isn't famous, it's just my mom. Get off your weird high horse. In any case, I guess that's just another reason why I have a special connection to this musical. Anyways, then they go on some weird fucking field trip into the middle of this labyrinth-like cave, and Tom Sawyer and Becky get lost. Obviously, you're taking a bunch of children into a fucking cave. And then Injun Joe finds them, but they successfully fight him off and escape the cave, and they find Merle's gold or something. I don't know. I don't remember, if I'm being honest. I watched this show once. In 7th grade, my class went on a field trip to go watch this show, be produced by some local performing arts school for kids. So go figure, I saw it like 7 years ago. I don't really remember it. But anyways, I really like this show's soundtrack. As I mentioned before, I think the bluegrass is really charming. And the story may not be anything special, but at the end of the day, this musical is pretty well executed. And I think it works better than some other musicals which have been more successful, like, you know, Beetlejuice. So I think we need a Tom Sawyer revival and a better recording of it. Number 2 is Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812. Now, this show isn't really obscure by any means. I mean, it took me a while to learn about it after I was already, you know, pretty well engaged in the musical theater community. But it did have a pretty decent run on Broadway, and it does have a lot of fans. The reason why I think this musical is underrated is because it never really gets performed anymore, and I don't think it ever will again. In my opinion, the reason why is mostly because of the set. The set of the show basically turns the entire theater into one big stage, and I think that basically makes it impossible to do like a touring production or something, because every theater is a little different. And I'd imagine it's very, very difficult to transform a theater into that set. Also, I think it got a little robbed in the Tonys because I think it came out the same year as Dear Evan Hansen, so it largely got overshadowed. But the musical itself is pretty good. The musical is based off of War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, which is a book that I've read, so let me go grab it. So this is War and Peace. The book is this big. And the musical, Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812, is this little fraction of it that's between my index finger and my thumb here. They made a full-length 2-hour musical out of just this tiny fraction of the whole story. That really shows you the scale of this fucking book. Great book though, would recommend. And so I think one of the other reasons why this musical didn't do too hot is because this is obviously a very complicated story. The segment of the book that was made into the musical is a section literally smack ass in the middle of this book. So I think it can get a little confusing because the story was taken out of context. And there are so many different characters in War and Peace that have so many different names that even the book, the novel, starts with a list of characters. It has 2 pages full of lists of characters, all their nicknames, and which family they're from. And that list of characters becomes the first song, the prologue in the musical. The first song of the musical is literally a list of characters and their names and who they are.
Gonna have to study up a little bit if you want to keep with the bus. 'Cause it's a complicated Russian novel. Everyone's got 9 different names.
And that should kind of give you a hint as to just how complicated this story is. And in my opinion, why it might not be the best story to make a musical out of. But Dave Malloy did it, and it's pretty good. The other thing that might be a turn-off for a lot of people is the music. The music is very experimental because Dave Malloy is one of those intellectual genius type people who likes to, do something that no one's ever done before. So some of the music is like traditional Russian tunes, which you would expect because War and Peace takes place in Russia.
Welcome to Moscow.
But then there's also like EDM.
Long as there's money and vodka, I'll keep a feather in my hat.
The story of War and Peace is essentially one long love triangle, which is centered around Natasha Rostova. Natasha is betrothed to Prince Andrei, who at the time of the musical is off fighting Napoleon. While he's away at war, Natasha gets really lonely and horny, and around the same time she starts to get hit off by this basically 19th century frat boy named Anatole Kuragin. At the same time, a character named Pierre is kind of just an incel degenerate. They call him old several times in the musical. I don't really know why, because he's like 30. He basically just stays all day at home and reads and gets drunk, and that's about it. Anyways, Anatole and Natasha try to elope, but that fails, and everyone's freaking out because obviously that's a really bad look for the Rostov family, who are like really high nobles. And at the end, Pierre visits Natasha. Really, he goes there to like shit on her for trying to elope, but by the end he just feels bad for her and tries to comfort her, and that's nice and everything. And then it kind of ends right there, and the ending feels kind of unresolved because again, it's a very short segment of a longer story. The ending of the musical is not the ending of this novel, so it feels kind of arbitrary. It kind of feels like Dave Malloy was telling as much of the story that he could, and then he like hit a time limit, so it's like, all right, I'm just gonna end this here. Because in the novel, by the end, Natasha and Pierre, they get married, and that feels like the logical conclusion to the story. You go through this whole love triangle with a failed elopement and everything, and then Pierre comes around. The logical conclusion is that Natasha and Pierre are gonna end up together, and that's what happens. But obviously the musical can't go all the way to the end, so it just doesn't cover that. So Natasha, Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812 has music that I personally really like. It has a story that is very good from a novel that I really like, and I think the musical does it justice, and I really want to see it. But also it has all these factors that make it very difficult to perform and kind of a strange one relative to other Broadway musicals. And because of that, it can't really get performed, and that kind of undermines the importance of the show. That's why I think it's very underappreciated. And the last musical I'm going to cover today is Once Upon a Mattress. Once Upon a Mattress is a musical, I think from like the 50s. I know of this show because I music directed for it. When I applied to be a music director, the possible shows that I could have gotten were Once Upon a Mattress or Spam-A-Lot, Monty Python's musical. And obviously I was really hoping to get Spam-A-Lot, but I ended up getting Once Upon a Mattress. But, I thought, can't complain. I'm still music directing, which is, huge. I love music directing. And it actually ended up being one of my favorite musicals. The music is fun. It's 50s, so it's very jazzy.
And get the Prince of Royal White. We have an opening for a princess.
The music was composed... The music was composed by a composer named Mary Rogers. Female Broadway composers, even by today's standards, are pretty rare, so it's kind of cool that there was a female composer for a musical that was written back in the 50s. Now, because this was a 50s musical and I hadn't heard of it at the time when I started music directing for it, I was expecting it to be super corny and hokey, but the music holds up, and more importantly, the dialogue super holds up. If anything, I think the dialogue aged to be even funnier now than it was back then. There are a lot of lines of characters saying that they want to kill themselves.
Pull yourself. They'll be here in a minute.
If she didn't cast, I'd just kill myself.
And a monologue about loveless marriage, which is really funny, and drug references.
Drink a little extract of opium and warm milk before going to bed.
It has so many quotable lines that I still use sometimes. There's this running joke where the prince's mother, the evil queen, keeps telling him it's time for his cocoa.
Douglas, sweetheart, stop pouting. Come along, darling. It's time for your cocoa.
But the cocoa, as far as I know, it like never actually gets addressed. I don't think he ever gets his cocoa. It's like the default way of ending a scene in the show is just for the evil queen and the prince to walk on stage and have her say, "Come on, it's time for your cocoa." I think in a way it really is Gen Z humor.
Boy flower, girl flower. Love each other. Boy flower, father. Girl flower, mother.
Like 70 years before Gen Z. The story to this is whatever. It's just, you know, a prince who has an evil mother who doesn't want him to get married because she's like a boy mom or something. And then surprise, surprise, the princess that he ends up getting is actually the, you know, tomboy, masculine, not ladylike one. It's a princess in the P. That's why it's called Once Upon a Mattress. It's because the princess's last child to be able to marry the prince is she has to be able to feel the pee underneath the mattresses. So, you know, cute enough story, but the dialogue is really where this musical shines, I think. Anyways, I'm sure that there are a bunch of other underrated musicals that I didn't talk about, you know, because there's a whole rabbit hole of shows that don't really get performed anymore. And I love learning about new shows. I love listening to new soundtracks. So if there are any you really like that are underrated, please let me know because I want to learn about all the musicals. I want to be a walking musical encyclopedia. Thank you and break legs.